So I'm doing a series of video blogs stemming from my special report issued on the lack of capacity at the Ministry of Natural Resources and the Ministry of Environment. 15 years of financial cutbacks and neglect have left those ministries with the inability to fulfill their mandates. In support of that, I did a number of case studies, and this blog is summarizing one of those case studies. The topic is the monitoring of fish and wildlife. You know, in Ontario we value our natural heritage, and certainly we love our wilderness in our north, and the fish and wildlife gives us such enjoyment. But and we count on the Ministry of Natural Resources to sort of look after that. We sort of assume that they have the responsibility of monitoring and making sure that it's there for that heritage is there for future generations. And if one looks closely at what actually is being done in terms of monitoring, the picture is not quite what I think most people would expect. There really is there's a responsibility to monitor, but there's very little monitoring of wildlife and certainly plants in Ontario. MNR just has very little capacity to do so. The only sort of mandatory program has to do with the forest industry, where there is a requirement under an environmental assessment where for the MNR to monitor forest species in terms of their long-term health, sort of as an overall concern about what's happening in the commercial forests, industrial forests in Northern Ontario. Recently, they used to have to monitor 92 different species, and that's been cut back a couple of years ago to 43 species. A little small aside here, it's interesting in that that's an environmental assessment issue. It's not really MNR, not in charge of that. MOE is approving those. But it's interesting that when they drop from 92 to 43 species to monitor in the forest industry, what is in the forest 43 are things like mice, voles, and chipmunks, which are not known to be terribly threatened. But what was dropped from in the 92 to 43 cut was woodland caribou. So they no longer have to monitor woodland caribou, which arguably are the most threatened species for forest management. So that's a little aside. But what else do they do? That's the sort of mandatory requirement they have to do. And it turns out they don't do a whole lot of other monitoring. They do some amount of surveys for moose and bear and white-tailed deer, which of course are game species and in support of their regulating the recreational hunting industry. But the Auditor General of Ontario has determined that the amount of monitoring they do, even on those species, is not enough to properly manage their wild, to feed their models to properly manage their wildlife. So an inadequate level of monitoring done there, just because they don't have the money to fly the surveys and do that kind of work. They also have, of course, fur-bearing animals. The trapping industry is quite large still in Ontario, and one would assume there's some level of monitoring there. But that monitoring is done on the harvest level. In other words, there's no direct monitoring of how wild little fur-bearing animals are running around in the forest. They simply say, oh, they didn't catch very many this year. I guess there aren't very many. And that's really not that satisfactory a way of monitoring a wildlife population. But again, there's no resources for that. Things like songbirds, important, not commercial, not recreational, but no, recreational in the sense of birders, but certainly we all take great joy and comfort of our songbird populations. Those are monitored mostly by volunteer groups, because MNR doesn't have the money to directly monitor. Things like, my gosh, a lot of the plants and insects and things just aren't monitored. There just isn't any kind of allocation for that. Even in the area of, where monitoring occurs, like the hunting area, the amount of money actually spent per capita, so much of the money comes from the hunting licenses and fishing licenses and that sort of thing. That's put into what they call a special purpose account, and it's allocated back for that purpose. But it has to be topped up from general tax revenues. The amount of general tax revenues topping up these kind of surveys is about $1 per person a year in Ontario spent out of the general revenues for fish and wildlife and plant monitoring and health. So just too little resources. I think the coupled with that is the fact there's too little resources to do the work, but there's also too few biologists and experts to really understand the complexity. I'm a biologist myself. It's a very specialized area. To understand the biology of a particular plant or animal group requires a fairly high level of expertise, and there just aren't enough of them to create the kind of knowledge and expertise necessary for this. So this is all piled up, not enough money, reliance on inappropriate methods, reliance on outside groups, lack of expertise, all builds up to make the argument that M&R has just not been given enough resources to monitor our wildlife, plant heritage in the province. And that's a problem.